Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to our June lecture in the Wolfson Centre lecture series. My name's Lucy Riglin. I'm a lecturer at the Wolfson Centre and I'll be introducing our speaker today. So a few things to note just before we get started. So first, this is a public lecture, so it's being recorded and will be posted on YouTube, where you'll also be able to see any other talks in this series that you might have missed. Please make sure that you're signed up to the Wolfson mailing list if you'd like to be kept informed about these and other upcoming Wolfson events. And finally, just to remind you that this session is an hour. Questions and discussions are encouraged after the talk. Within that hour, please post your questions via the Q&A box, which you should be able to see at the top of your Teams screen. I won't really be monitoring the chat, so please do use that Q&A function for your questions. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Anita Thapar, who is a clinical academic child and adolescent psychiatrist. She was co-chair for the Welsh Government Ministerial Advisory Group on Neurodivergence and chair of the NHS England ADHD Taskforce. Her research focuses on ADHD and youth mental health, and she's lead editor of Rutter's textbook of child and adolescent psychiatry. Anita was awarded a CBE for services to child and adolescent psychiatry, President's Medal from the Royal College of Psychiatrists for contribution to policy, public knowledge, education, and meeting population and patient care needs, the Ruane Prize for outstanding child and adolescent psychiatric research, and World ADHD Federation Medal for her contributions to ADHD. She's also been a key leader in the Wolfson Centre for Young People's Mental Health here at Cardiff University. So she played an instrumental role in establishing the centre. She led our work using genetic approaches to identify environmental factors that contribute to anxiety and depression, and has been a key link between researchers at the centre with both NHS and policy. And I'm sure that her talk today on ADHD service challenges and ways forward with lessons from the NHS-E Independent ADHD Taskforce will be of great interest to those of us interested in understanding and improving support for young people with ADHD. And we thank her very much for coming to speak with us today. So without further ado, over to you, Professor Thapar.
Thank you, Lucy, for the kind introduction. I'm very impressed there are people here on such a hot afternoon, and you're not all down at the beach. So thank you for coming along. Right, let's see. So I'm going to talk about the NHS England Independent ADHD Taskforce, but of course, just to highlight at the beginning, we're in Wales and we're in a devolved nation. So this doesn't apply to Wales or the devolved nations, but I've been closely linked with Welsh Government and colleagues there for many more years. And actually, the reason I was asked to be chair of the NHS England Taskforce was because of the work that's being done in Wales. So, and of course, the issues are similar across nations. These are my disclosures. All these roles I had, including the task force chair, were unpaid. So I'm just going to talk about what it's like engaging in policy. So some of you may be scientists, clinicians, and what the impacts, if you're trying to engage in policy development, the impacts of a shifting political landscape are when you come from a scientific and clinical background. I'm going to talk about the task force report recommendations. There was an interim report, and then the part 2 recommendations were published. I'm just going to talk about since the publication, what sorts of changes have been implemented and what have been the challenges, because I think it's important to sort of understand some of those if it's something that you are going to get engaged in or have the opportunity, which I've been really fortunate in my career in having that opportunity of becoming involved. So we may think, I've always thought of myself, well, I'm a clinician, I'm a researcher, I don't actually have to think about politics, but It is actually really relevant, particularly when you engage in policy. So in 2024, at the start of 2024 spring, NHS England said that they were going to launch a cross-sector ADHD task force. And I think it's really important to know, because I was involved in a couple of charities at that time, how much excitement there was, because ADHD had not really been looked at before in the NHS in England. So this was a really big deal for the ADHD community. Huge excitement. So in May 2024, the co-chairs were announced. So it was me, and at the time I agreed because my co-chair, Jo Killian, was the chair of Local Government Association in England, so would bring expertise around education, housing, social care, of course, areas as a psychiatrist I don't have expertise in, and most importantly, she was from England, which I also did not have expertise in. So that was good that we had two co-chairs. However, then things, as soon as that had been decided, there was a general election. The UK had a general election in June 2024, and that was actually really relevant because what happened is we had a new government. The Labour government came in for the UK, this is now. Wes Streeting was appointed as Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. Stephen Kinnock, who interestingly is a Welsh MP and a native by origin from Wales, became the lead for neurodivergence. And at that time, the person who'd really championed the task force was Amanda Pritchard, who is the chief executive of NHS England. Now, for those, if there's anybody on this talk who's from England, you'll know this, but I had to learn this because it's different in Wales. In England, they had 42 English health boards, and so these are linked to NHS England. NHS England then would be linked with Department of Health and Social Care. And when there was a new government, the idea, though, was to work much more closely with NHS England than the previous government had. So what were the challenges in England? The estimated wait times were really, really long. Adults, 12 weeks to 10 years, children, 5 weeks to 5 years. And some areas in England, you have the choice of private providers, but you're paid by the NHS. In referrals in March 2024 versus March 2025, there had been an estimated increase 13.5% of referrals. And that is true across the UK and across Europe. It was nothing particular to England. So there were many challenges, and there was a lot of alarm about the rise in ADHD prescriptions. So this is data from the BBC reported as to the prescribing of ADHD medications for children and for adults. So the task force, what were we asked to do is question is, why is demand increased and how should we manage it? Identify ways to improve care for people living with ADHD and across different sectors, not just health, and provide NHS England with initial recommendations in 5 months. There was quite a lot of pressure to get recommendations in before the government spending review in the spring of 2025, and then provide final recommendations in 10 months. So very short timetable. Just want to highlight the sort of first topic, which is the landscape, the political landscape, and what this might mean. And I think our timing, we encountered many changes. So in 2024, we had the government change. So we didn't know, will the task force go ahead? So we were, Jo Killian and I were just waiting. In August 2024, it reached Wes Streeting, and it was given the go-ahead by government. So that was good news. However, a lot of people in local government had become MPs, and Jo Killian resigned. And I thought, oh, they'll find another chair. But in August, the news was broken to me that I was now the sole chair, which, was, as you can imagine, if you're an academic, was really felt quite daunting. So, but anyway, that's how it was. I found myself. So 2025, there were even more changes. So in March, NHS England was abolished, and the Chief Executive NHS England, Amanda Pritchard, and other senior staff were resigned in March. Before March, actually, it was just before March. NHS England, as I said, was abolished. Literally got the information through news, and I just submitted part 1 of the report on behalf of our task force. The new NHS Chief Executive, Jim Mackey, started the 1st of April, and the idea was that in England, the NHS England would then merge with the Department of Health and Social Care. So nobody really knew what was happening through April, so we had to pause. And of course, with NHS England changes, that sort of task force support team was no longer present. However, we met our deadlines, got the task force report, part 1, submitted on time by spring 2025. And of course, it arrived as soon as there was a new chief executive of NHS England, and it required approval from Jim Mackey and from government. But fair dues, despite all the changes, it was looked at and approved, and part 1 was published June 2025 ahead of the spending review. Part 2, the request was to focus on implementation and also the interface with education, criminal justice and work. So by July, we had submitted the part 2 report, but just as we were submitting it, the NHS England published its 10-year plan for NHS England, for the NHS. And so I was asked on the Friday, can you look again at your report to check, to see that it aligns? So lots of changes, but it was resubmitted then, still in July, on time. And the part 2 report recommendations were published in autumn of 2025. And during that time, I built up a good relationship with Minister Kinnock. But then a new minister was appointed as a junior minister to be in charge of neurodivergence, Zubir Ahmed, who's also a doctor. He's a surgeon by background. Just to highlight that since then, and of course we've approached them, we've got a new Secretary of State in England. This is now, of course, it does not apply to us in Wales, for Health and Social Care and Minister overseeing neurodivergence. So quite a few different ministers I've been contacting. So anyway, what are the interim report recommendations? Well, first of all, let me just say a little bit about the task force. One of the things I'd learned from working in Wales and with Welsh Government and as well for our research is the importance of co-development. So actually, in terms of the task force membership, the backgrounds, we actually did, we worked with Health Watch in England for people with lived experience to decide who should be on the main task force, what sort of people. And actually there were 11 members in the end, many of whom had lived experience of ADHD, but also had other backgrounds in education, NHS primary and secondary care, the criminal justice system and employment expertise. As well as the main task force, we had a lived experience group who were representatives and who were responsible then for outreaching to local communities and through their groups. Having a background in research, wanted all the task force report recommendations to be really based in research evidence. So we assembled a group of scientists who then linked in with other scientists and to generate that evidence. So we had an experts in evidence group. And also there was a group of NHS practitioners across England, different disciplines, who formed a clinical reference group. So it was really quite a big thing. And I don't think that co-development model had been done before, or at least that's what people told me, my colleagues in NHS England. But people were really receptive, really keen to embrace a different way of working. Just to say how engaged people were. This is just the lived experience group, as well as the verbal feedback. We had 200 pages of documents, 200 pages summarized for me to read through as well. And it was a really, really important aspect of the task force group. And the researchers, for anyone who is a scientist by background, the evidence annex was excellent. They really spent a lot of time and trouble doing that, and the annex to the task force reports actually really very well researched and referenced. So when I started the task force work, it was interesting to what were the perceptions I encountered, and I think it's fair to say, because there was so much co-development in Wales, I hadn't really encountered them in Wales, but at high levels in you know, not everyone, but there was quite a strong belief that ADHD is overdiagnosed, and in England and the UK it's really overtreated, and that really was a starting belief and a really common perception that really had to be discussed with the Department of Health and with NHS England. For some people, not everyone, there was also, I got feedback that getting a diagnosis and treatment are harmful for people. We've just expanded diagnosis so much, it's over medicalized. And actually that the increase in referrals are huge increases because TikTok and social media are driving demand. Yeah, people saying the huge increases in referrals and prescribing, it's all a social phenomena and a major concern. I have to just emphasize, not everyone was this, but it's a really still quite a powerful voice here. And we have to sort of take this into account when you're doing something like this. And, you know, people saying, well, you know, we used to have ADHD. So in the spring of 2025, we were submitted, the task force report is published in June. So the first thing we had to highlight is how important the impact of ADHD is. It's not trivial, and the evidence from multiple research studies, the evidence people were really good here. The researchers got all the evidence together. When it's unsupported, it's really a potent route into educational failure, long-term unemployment, crime, substance misuse, suicide, and mental and physical illness. There were no England, UK costs, but we could estimate from data in Sweden, where they'd looked at siblings, one with ADHD and one without, that the economic costs to, of course, individuals affected, but the government, at least 17 billion were calculated for England, are avoidable, because when appropriately supported, people with ADHD can thrive and fully engage. The background information, people looked through all the research on prevalence and NHS prevalence in the population and the NHS prevalence. And in England, as it is in Wales and across the UK, there was very clear converging evidence from multiple sources. ADHD is underdiagnosed and undertreated. So despite the popular belief of overtreatment, the increased referrals, of course, is a reality, and that is across Europe. It was not just the UK. And people highlight multiple potential reasons: increased awareness. You don't know, people didn't know about it. Research findings. When I first trained in psychiatry, used to think it's only child and adolescent psychiatry, it doesn't affect adults. We now know that's wrong. It was typically thought of as only affecting boys. We now know that that's not the case. It affects women. So lots of research changes, stigma, and as I said, there were multiple. This was not specific to the UK. The other thing we highlight is that the prevalence of ADHD globally is 3 to 5%, and actually other health conditions or anything else in the NHS that's this prevalent are not managed in psychiatry, psychology, and mental health services. They're managed in primary care, the way our system is set up. And so our services and personnel is just inadequate to ever catch up to anything like what the true prevalence of ADHD is. So really have to rethink what current systems are. And just if those who are interested, The scientists, I elected not to be on this paper because I was in the middle of doing the task force report and did not want to be aligned to any view at that stage. But they published, if anyone's interested, the underdiagnosis and undertreatment, and actually that most people with ADHD have not been accessing services or obtaining treatment. We also highlighted, and I think that's true across other parts of the UK as well, that often sectors outside of health, including schools, would say they have to wait for a diagnosis provided by a clinician before support. So it's really difficult. So this would be driving referrals, and then people would have really long wait lists, and meantime the situation would be really adversely affected. And we had a number of people who were in the lived experience group where really, very sadly, children had killed themselves, and these are parents and of people who are waiting, or where the ADHD, there'd been a delay in being picked up. Perception outside the NHS that anything to do with ADHD is medical. I'm not saying everyone, but not really to do with other sectors. It's got to be medically, clinically led, and parents waiting and others waiting for special educational needs recognition, which is expensive in time, costs, and emotional reserve for parents, schools, and of course local authorities. The other thing is ADHD NICE guidance is very specific about who can diagnose ADHD. So it's generally you have to be sort of specially qualified. But what we found across England is the NICE guidance is interpreted differently by different NHS and private providers. So some people would say you've got to have a super specialist psychiatrist to make a diagnosis, and others would say just go on a 2-hour training course and that is enough. So there was huge concerns about quality. And most services, and I think that's true across the UK, still using pen and paper, which is a huge burden for people with ADHD, but also for clinicians. You're filling in questionnaires. I remember doing this in clinic, adding them all up by hand, people having to repeatedly, fill measures in, and it's, or pen and paper still, no different to when I first became a psychiatrist in '86. And we just wanted to give a positive message that, yes, there are these adverse outcomes, but there are interventions that can help. And what you want to do is start early before the impacts and the adverse outcomes appear, because then it becomes much more complicated. As I've said, ADHD care was delivered primarily by the specialist sector across the UK. Most is publicly funded by the NHS and just was not set up for that type of prevalence. And with increased demands, wait lists were just escalating, and very limited GP involvement, including across, of course, this is England, but would apply to areas in Wales as well. GPs having so much burden that they were dropping out of shared care prescribing, which was becoming then a problem, or people being seen by right to choose or private providers, and concerns about the authenticity of the diagnosis, so that the diagnosis was often not recognised then by the GP or the NHS. So in summer 2025, we submitted the task force. It was published in the autumn, and we aligned these with NHS England's sort of government, UK government priorities for the changes, the 10-year plan, which is to focus on prevention, shift to primary care, neighbourhood hubs, and digitisation. And I don't think any of this is really fundamentally different from the thinking that we would do well, I can't speak for all devolved nations, but we've been thinking in Wales. So I think it was really important to highlight that ADHD is not just health. It's irrelevant to education, employment, and the criminal justice system. And the first thing we found with the task force is the data quality was really poor. We just could not work out who was seeing what was happening. And what we highlighted is that these are all different departments: Department for Education, Department for Health, Employment. We recommended that actually one department doing it in isolation of others, that actually there needs to be holistic spending plans for ADHD. This task force report was obviously on ADHD, but some aspects would obviously be relevant for neurodivergence as a whole. And we just highlighted that actually there has to be integration across all these systems and join up around ADHD and neurodivergence, not just from government, but all the way down to locality. We also highlighted that actually all these sectors, and of course I know that this has been looked at a lot in Wales in the last few years, that training across all these sectors to recognise and support ADHD at an early stage, and also at a local level create partnerships between different sectors around supporting ADHD. We made the recommendation, Department of Health and Social Care in England, to fund training programmes, including for primary care, because we talked quite a lot to the Royal College of GPs and they said, well, some GPs are really keen. We had a GP on our task force, but they just don't have the training. We said ADHD really can't be just a super psychiatrist who sees ADHD. It's too common. It's got to be a core competency for everyone who works in mental health and, of course, community paediatricians with much better data. So the first thing's prevention. Well, we highlighted that actually ADHD is a really, really good target here, because without appropriate early support, we know that ADHD can lead to adverse outcomes, and you need to start early. You don't need a diagnosis, and you don't need to, you can base it around needs. So what we highlighted is that early support in the preschool years and through schools and in sectors other than health should be needs-led, that's uncoupled from diagnosis. We have developed diagnosis is really important for clinical decision-making, but actually we don't know, diagnosis isn't the best way of deciding what's the best support in school, what's the best support in work. So this is needs-led support. We also highlighted evidence around in the preschool years how important those early years intervention was, and we looked at all, the Sure Start, Flying Start schemes across the UK, which had been running, actually all showed long-term benefits. They weren't immediate, but funding had been stopped for those, but we suggested that these need to be, now we need to move on to new schemes like Sure Start, which offer early parenting interventions right from preschool, which aren't diagnosis specific, needs led, but also that are neurodivergent friendly, both for parents who may be neurodivergent themselves and for the child. So to be, obviously in here we talked about ADHD, but also this would apply for neurodivergence as well. And there's lots of research. The evidence group highlighted that evidence-based parenting packages, they don't reduce ADHD symptoms, but they improve parent-child relationship quality and comorbid behaviour. And the early Sure Start, as I said, showed benefits to educational, social outcomes and reduction in SEND. And there weren't very many ADHD programs, and there was quite a lot of development in app-based programs, but these haven't really been evaluated, shown as yet to be cost effective. But the New Forest parenting program, which I know in some parts of Wales are used, was shown to be cost effective. We also highlighted the importance of school, and again, for those of us who in Wales will recognise that has already has been looked at, but mental health support team hadn't been rolled out completely in England when we started. We said that was a priority to roll out, but we highlighted that actually diagnostic silos aren't helpful because co-occurrence is so common, and also then you're really being focused on diagnosis. So we suggested that school mental health support needs to be inclusive around neurodivergence and be geared up to be inclusive of neurodivergent people, children with ADHD. We also highlighted, once upon a time this used to happen when we first started, but of course demands are such that's become much more challenging, and this of course is England now, that schools need a really explicit link with ADHD clinical services for consultation and rapid access. Just thinking of some of the people in the lived experience group who had lost children. This was may not have been a popular suggestion, but we just thought we're building up to wait lists in England of up to 17 years, and we thought something has to be done to address very quickly that backlog. And one thing that would be actually those on wait list improve support and signposting, local services that are available in the meantime, and evaluate safe triage and prioritising. We highlighted evaluation because actually screening questionnaires, when we showed that the evidence group showed that we're not enough, you actually suggested, most of the guidance was suggesting you actually have to talk to people. And I guess we're familiar with that in primary care, triage in primary care, people have to talk to whoever is waiting. We highlighted a particular risk group as the 11 to 25-year-old group because that's the peak age of onset of mental health problems. It's also the transition from education into work, the issues around, particularly of course salient around the time we've done the task force, and now the issue of getting employment, peer support, and this problem with the 18 cut-off we had. And we talked to a number of countries who've evaluated this, the integrated youth services, and I think probably the best example, I know I talked to colleagues in Welsh Government about this, is the Canadian system, because they also have a primary care-led system. We recommended that we should evaluate integrated youth services, which are basically a one-stop shop for young people. They're co-designed by young people. People literally can walk in, and you've got all the different expertise in that service. And what the research in Canada by my colleague Jo Henderson found, it was faster than CAMHS, and actually less specialist time was needed. And people may say, well, how many of these were ADHD? Actually, about a third coming here had ADHD, but as I said, it was not primarily diagnosis led. But although of those who needed that sort of specialist diagnostic intervention could access it, we said we have to move to a more generalist model. It's too common. Having this very, very highly specialised system, it's just not going to work. And we suggested task sharing and including multiple disciplines, primary care, the voluntary sector, education, social work, and other sectors, with a single front door with access to different types of support. And again, we really felt concerned about diagnostic and service silos because co-occurrence is so typical. We talked to the Royal College of GPs and suggested an expanded role of primary care. Now, GPs have to take on everything. My husband was a GP, so I'm very aware of this, and we asked Department of Health and Social Care, we made this recommendation to actually incentivise GP practices to take on general aspects of ADHD care, particularly around more straightforward ADHD and greater leadership. So, for example, the annual physical checks, and a lot of GPs were really interested in ADHD to develop some sort of specialist GPs who would be specifically trained around ADHD, but it would be joined up with mental health services so that there would be support and consultation, which is what happens for like diabetes, asthma, and other common conditions. We also highlighted we're going to move to a generalist model, and we don't want over medicalisation, but we don't want also people not to be able to access what they need. We highlighted that a stepped care, where, as you know, the NICE guidance suggests starting with self-help, psychoeducation, lifestyle changes, and then moving to, so starting with the non-pharmacological interventions before moving to the pharmacological interventions. So like environmental adjustment, psychoeducation, self-management, parenting, and the post-diagnostic support. And we suggested that NIHR, the main research funder, evaluate some of these stepped care models that would work across sectors, not just the NHS. We were really concerned about regulation and quality, particularly in England. There were huge expansion of private providers, but even in Wales, people can still access private, and there's some are very good, but some what people were questioning. So we highlighted that if Department of Health work with NICE to review its definition of specialist, because it was not clear to everyone interpreted it differently. We also asked NHS-E to produce a quality standards framework for ADHD so that each service provider could comply with published standards. And we also recommended some equity for wait times for ADHD and with other health conditions, and to monitor, this concern about overdiagnosis. Well, why don't we monitor, look at our rates of diagnosis and in real time our prescribing, as well as also, of course, wait times. We talked about actually harnessing digital technologies. The evidence around ADHD has changed, but services, it's been really difficult. And some things are really safe and acceptable, and I know some of this is being piloted in Wales and in parts of England now, digital records, patient letters, using AI to help here, questionnaires, the routine data collection and capture in clinics like the QB test for children. It hasn't been evaluated yet in adults, but we thought there was even more digitalization, and we are nice to scope an early value assessment and digital projects for ADHD. So changes and challenges. So what appears to change? At the same time that we did our task force, there was Department for Education Task and Finish group for England, this is. So I sat on that group, and the chair of that group sat on our NHS England ADHD group. So we were very joined up, but it was really interesting, completely different groups. I mean, of course, all the people on the Task and Finish education group were mainly from an education background with many teachers, but both groups independently said you've got to uncouple diagnosis from support and agree to a needs-led, not diagnosis-driven support, rolling out the school mental health team. Both reports highlighted that, and early years support and intervention. And that's actually has been funded in England now with the Best Start family support and the integrated youth systems. Well, it's interesting how closely they will model the evaluated systems elsewhere in the world, but I am aware that youth hubs have been initiated. So the good news is NHS England, the chief exec, supported the recommendations of the task force. It got published. We had very positive meetings with the Royal College of GPs. It was endorsed by Royal College of Psychiatrists. We had multiple meetings with the NICE and the research funder NIHR, and the NHS England was working on waiting list support measures and definitely focusing quickly on better data capture. However, the reality of it is quite a few of the recommendations we made were requiring money. So I think you have to look at the challenges, severe constraints on funding healthcare in the UK and the geopolitical situation. And one of the issues was that there was still repeated focus on overdiagnosis, even when we'd finished our report. So as soon as we'd published, the then UK Health Secretary ordered a review. It's a prevalence review. Of course, the press did pick it up about overdiagnosis. I think he did change what he said then in The Guardian. But basically, it's repeating the work, at least for ADHD, not for everything, the work of the task force. So the challenges are that actually UK government did not respond. There was no formal response to the task force report or its recommendations or any expressed will to take it forward. So that was really deeply disappointing for the ADHD community. And of course, people really invested so much of their own time in it. And meantime, there's around 700,000 people, that's just in England alone, waiting for an ADHD assessment. I have to say, of course, we've got the same challenges in Wales with wait times, but my experience just in the last 5 years or so, the views around neurodivergence have been quite different historically, and there was really quite a different experience engaging in policy. So I was quite naive, I think, when I went into the work in England. But the good news, I'll just finish with something very positive. There's an all-party parliamentary group ADHD, which is actually chaired by Joe Platt, who's a Labour MP, but there's people from all political parties. Really, several of the task force report, and particularly the representative of the lived experience group, was extremely eloquent, really strongly supportive of the task force recommendations, wanting to push it through. They, on our behalf, made contact with the new Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. As I said, there's somebody new now, James Murray for England. So we're waiting to hear what's going to happen there, whether he will meet with us. So what are the personal reflections? For those of you who are scientists, if you get asked to do it, was really rewarding. I really enjoyed doing it because you do research, and if you're a clinician as well, you really want to make a difference, and you think, oh, you really want that science to make a difference. And it was really rewarding, but it was also extremely challenging for a variety of reasons. Some changes are already being implemented, but many of them, the problem is require funding or a redistribution of funding, although maybe not as much as people may be concerned about. If there's join up and utilising what we've got to sort of in a better way. There are really unexpected challenges from many different quarters. I mean, really, I never thought I was going to be in 2026. Over the years, I've worked on research on ADHD since 1991. I have many challenges about people not believing ADHD. It really makes me feel for the ADHD community, the authenticity being doubted, but I did have that from some senior people who are very influential. You had to learn to deal with rapidly shifting political landscapes. You still keep your eye on the ball. It was very time consuming. Weekends and evenings went. Very short deadlines, and you had to be open to repeated feedback. And as I said, as scientists, you think, well, everyone's surely going to follow the evidence. And actually, I think somebody told me when I was in the middle of this, and I think that's really for anyone who's got a scientific background going into this, it's politics. It's not just evidence. So you have to bear that in mind. And I don't think I'd been aware of it. I think it was quite a different sort of feel in other things I've been involved in. But I'd just like to acknowledge, I mean, I'm speaking for this and I was the chair, but there were so many people who are on the task force and who have really remained passionate about the findings. These are the evidence synthesis group, chaired by Tamsin Ford, lived experience group, who then did a huge amount of work, huge amount of outreach, and for them it was really difficult with NHS England suddenly disappearing. Suddenly all that support infrastructure around it disappeared. There were many senior clinicians involved. There was a lot of interaction with scientists around the world and locally. And really, I have to say, this would not have got across the line. Catherine Hinwood, at that time, was Director of ADHD in NHS England, passionate about ADHD. And of course, I'm not in NHS England. She really helped get it over the finish line, and working together was just a real pleasure. Thank you. There's time for questions.
Thank you very much, Anita. That was an excellent talk, really interesting. So just a reminder to people, we've got time, as Anita said, for questions and discussion. There's a Q&A button that should be at the top of your team screen. If you could pop your questions in there, then we can discuss them. So I've had a couple through already, which I'll read out for Anita. So we've had one from Francis Rice that says, thank you for the talk. In delivering shared care successfully, as you say, there'll be a need to be incentives and system level change. Can you say something about what types of incentives would help deliver shared care, and which stakeholders can have advocacy roles to help ensure this happens?
So it's very interesting because my GP colleague, Lucy Clement, who is on the task force, has been an amazing force, and she has lived experience of ADHD as well. And she pushed through GPs agreeing to engage in pretty much all the things we'd said. But GPs get paid for services provided. It's called an enhanced service payment. So that's basically how GPs get paid. So I think a crucial thing is government has to sort of contract with GPs. And I think in England, they're having the new neighbourhood hubs. This would be an ideal time to do it, to make it part of the enhanced care supplement that they would get. So, yeah, the will is there in primary care, but it needs political will. And of course, in the short term, it will cost, but in the longer term, it may be more sustainable. And just to give an idea, I mean, I think there's two things to consider here, which I think are really salient. One is Australia quite a few states now are doing that. So GPs are being trained. My colleague Dave Coghill has been training people in around ADHD, so that's already happening in large swathes of Australia. The concern, I think, is around ADHD, unlike, say, asthma or diabetes, is, of course, the first line treatment is a stimulant, is a control drug. So one of the things my colleagues in the States are trialing, and unfortunately the research hasn't been found, but I also think that we also maybe need some pilots to test and learn, is where GPs will do the second line, which is a non-control drug, use the second line treatments like atomoxetine as first line, and then only shift to sort of specialist primary care or special, where there's going to be more intensive and careful follow-up for the stimulant medication. And it's very interesting because just to give a local example, he's a busy clinician, so I don't think he'd be on call, but one of my local colleagues works in Park Prison, and he, of course, because of this population, and this was considered very innovative by the criminal justice system. We're doing this in Wales. He starts people first line on atomoxetine, and sort of, audit data suggests that there's improvements. I think there's models that we could try. Which stakeholders can have advocacy roles? Well, I think, the ADHD community will be very important in this. I think it does boil down to political will, which is why I'm very keen to see the new, and it's not just me. I think the most powerful voice actually comes from, the people with lived experience, that is to really push for that. I do think it has to be that, but I think probably everyone can play a part. I think one thing, it's very interesting how different countries have responded to the increase in demand. And I don't think it's fair to say everyone, all my colleagues say all the countries have struggled, and just expanding secondary care is not, I think my colleagues say that's not the way forward. But what's happening in the UK, and of course it's particularly salient in England, where you've had right to choose, is because people can't be seen in the NHS, there's a huge expansion of private providers with no regulation. And I think that's quite an issue by not addressing it. Sorry, I'm digressing. But I think, advocacy has to come from all of us. But I always feel that it's particularly powerful when you hear the voices of somebody whose child didn't get assessed and treated and killed themselves. We had multiple stories like this. I hope that answers your questions. I don't know really what sort of, I'm trying my best. That's why you never see me, Fran, because all I do is try and, but you have to believe that ADHD is something real and that actually is worth addressing first. So that dialogue, I'll be interested to see what the prevalence review will suggest. It's the same scientists involved. So we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you. So we've had a few questions coming in now. So one from Georgia Michelini, who says, "Thank you, Anita, for the wonderful talk. How likely do you think it will be that we'll move to a joint holistic primary care model to ADHD and neurodevelopmental disorders, and often co-occurring common mental health challenges in the next few years? And what do you think the main barriers might be?" You've touched on some of these already.
Well, some sectors may be going in screaming, but I cannot see an alternative. But I think the most important thing, I was talking to a GP, is primary care doesn't mean necessarily always an expensive GP. Primary care, can involve schools. It can involve, support groups that are aligned. But so I think it has to move out of the super specialist area. There's a place for specialism, without a doubt, the complicated ADHD that's difficult, but there's lots of things that can be done at a sort of more community level, which can involve the pharmacist, the GP practice, nurses, but I think maybe also a little bit differently other sectors as well, although, even for other physical health, you still have charities and others playing an important role. So I think but it's not joined up at the moment. And I think that's quite hard to mandate centrally. To some extent, it also has to be on what's available locally. But I think it will be very difficult, Georgia. I don't know how long it will take not to move to that, because the alternative is saying there's nothing available. And I think that it may take time, but I think it'll be very difficult to say that, given the research and international changes.
Thank you. Greg Chick has said, private assessments, sometimes the threshold is too low or the quality is lacking. Wouldn't you agree? Do you have advice on redesigning the assessment and treatment pathway in Wales, like for children, to balance genuine need with evidence and sustainability beyond what you've already outlined?
I think it's very, we were really careful, because I think all providers, regardless of whether you're NHS or private, but of course it's much harder, I guess, with an independent provider. Some were very good, actually, and I know colleagues of mine, people who've trained with me, are now working in the independent sector, and it's very rigorous, and others aren't. So yes, it's very variable, and the quality sometimes may be lacking in some, but not all. So I think that's why we do need some sort of quality standards or some sort of regulation, because otherwise, how does the person who know that they're paying for something which is, as I said to one politician, it's a bit like the Wild West. You've got to sort of regulate it somehow, and the threshold too low. Well, of course, the incentives, of course, will be different as well. I mean, I quite often had people coming for a second opinion and would say, well, look, this isn't ADHD, but I would draw a little, liability threshold model and say, look, there is a continuum. It's a bit like blood pressure or lipids. There's a certain point at which you think you really want to treat. The risks of treatment outweigh, are lower than the potential benefits, but you're a bit lower, so you want to try the other things. And I think there are ways of doing that, and that might be more difficult in the private sector. But as I said, I don't think I can speak for all the private sector, because it's not the same. And I feel that, yes, well-regulated private sector, maybe, I won't get into any political discussions here. But I think regardless of service, whoever's providing the service, you need a quality when you've come to decisions about medication treatment, particularly the other non-pharmacological interventions. We said you could call it probable ADHD. I mean, you can still join a support if you've got many features of ADHD. You can still look at self-management and psychoeducation and benefit without first having to get the diagnosis. Do I have advice on redesigning the assessment and treatment pathways? I have a conflict of interest, because I've obviously been involved in Wales. I think the biggest challenge is that we've got an increase, the increased prevalence. We used to have a very narrow set of criteria for ADHD before. Lucy and I have talked quite often, is it scientifically warranted to broaden it? We suspect not. And not to it's maybe risky to just say, oh, we're not going to follow ICD and DSM. So we have a reality of an increased prevalence. And I think, in Wales, it has actually been ahead of many nations, but I think we still do need to think about better linking up between NHS and other sectors, and also seeing what we've got there to be much more ND friendly. So support systems in school. Yeah. So sorry, I would say it's the same sorts of issues that we could address in Wales, but which we have started addressing, but that were in the task force report.
Brilliant. Thank you. And we've got 5 more minutes, so I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more questions. So we've had one from Sian Lewis. So you talked about sort of digitalisation. She said, what are your thoughts on the use of B test in adult ADHD diagnosis, what might the benefits and challenges of piloting its use in adults be?
This is a really interesting question, Sean, because actually, when the first draft of the recommendations, and one of my colleagues in adult psychiatry said, hey, you can't put that in about adult ADHD because, of course, the QB test hasn't been evaluated. So you see the scientists in me are saying, oh, yeah, let's wait for randomized control trials of everything. But the policy and practitioner in me think we can't wait for everything. And that there's I love the Department for Education, what they call test and learn. So I think the answer is, I think it is worth piloting, bearing in mind it has not been properly evaluated. So considering, I guess, it doesn't matter if you over include people, but I think if you lock people off services for something which hasn't been evaluated, that's much more risky. So I think it depends what the purpose is. I think if it's an adjunct to what you're using clinically, that could be helpful. But I think as a pilot, I think personally, I mean, probably scientific colleagues will be just throwing their hands up. Well, I am a scientist, but put their hands up in the air. But I sort of understand also, yeah, come on, where's the trials? It's a bit like the atomoxetine. When's the trial going to come out of primary care prescribing it? I just think, well, should we just test and learn? So, Sian, yeah, I think, and I know it is being piloted, but I think that data needs to be shared, because I'm sure people are piloting lots of things, but no one knows about it. Everyone's doing it in their own area across the UK. It's really hard to share good practice. Like Sussex has moved to a much more primary care model. How would you know that unless you talk to clinicians in Sussex? I hope that answers the question. Challenges are, yeah, if you use it to lock people off a wait list or put undue.
So I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, Anita, because we've had a lovely one from Midithir Mandan, who says, hi, Anita, thank you for your talk. It was very inspiring. What advice would you give to aspiring researchers that would like to work on challenging these misconceptions around ADHD?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that's a really nice question. Lucy, you and I have talked about it. I mean, actually, the first thing I would say is when you're doing the science, you've got to be sort of in equipoise. Like, you shouldn't care about the answer. It's got to be the truth ultimately. So I think that's the first thing. I mean, when you're writing policy, you can be a bit more emotive, but actually as a scientist, but I think when so in terms of actually doing the research, we have to be, like Fran Rice will remember, we thought maternal smoking caused ADHD. It did not. That all the papers we'd done before were wrong. And you just have to let go of that idea and move on. But challenging those misconceptions. I think the really interesting thing, I was just at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, I think clinicians pretty much get this. I think one way you could do is by working with the ADHD community, because what we do, if you're a researcher, you've got the research evidence and sharing it and arming people with that. Also, colleagues who work in government and policy, I can see Sian is on here, and I think, like, obviously they are the experts in policy. It's not people like me. I'm not an expert in government, but like you, if you've got the researchers, like it's sharing that information with people who can make a difference, with policy makers, the ADHD community. I mean, yes, of course, clinicians, but I haven't generally found that to be an issue. And making, I guess, it's almost like you write the scientific paper, but you also need to sort of like summarize things in an accessible way as well. And I think that's what I sort of got much more interested in now, is doing blogs and things, because, yeah, people aren't going to read whole scientific papers always. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question. And I do think it's really important. And I kept saying to ministers, I said, well, but this is scientific evidence. You don't ignore it for high blood pressure. Why are you doing it here? But as I said, you have to bear in mind, it isn't, you know, you think you're a scientist, oh, well, we've got all this evidence. It might not get implemented if it doesn't, is not fitting with, or if there's no money, you know, but there you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anita. It's 3 o'clock, so I think we should wrap up. Thank you very much for your excellent talk. Thank you, everyone, for the discussion. Apologies to those whose questions we didn't quite get to. Thank you all for participating, and I hope to see you all at the next Wolfson public lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.